The framework of two states has been used by many actors around the world in a very sort of performative way to avoid making any kind of commitment or statement to ending occupation. So rather than saying, such and such country is committed to ending occupation and apartheid and the oppression of the Palestinian people, they can just say, we're committed to a two-state solution, blah, blah, blah. So it's provided, certainly on like a discursive level, it's been very useful for states to avoid talking about their real responsibilities under international law, which is not a two-state solution, but rather ending the oppression of Palestinians across the land of Palestine. So it's really a formula that has perpetuated Palestinian oppression.
Salamat everyone. You are listening to Red Inverted Triangle. This show is about the ongoing struggle for liberation in Palestine, produced on the unceded lands of the Gadigal people. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Like Palestine, Australia is the ground zero of a genocide that has been occurring for over 200 years and continues to this day. From the river to the sea, this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. My name is Ahmed. I am a Palestinian living on this stolen land, and I'll be your host. This podcast aims to provide the Palestinian story, Palestinian narrative. It's necessary because we live in a heavily indoctrinated society where, as Palestinians, being able to speak, to tell our stories and narrate is the ultimate form of resistance. That's right, resistance, hence the name of our show, Red Inverted Triangle. Each week, we'll be bringing you different segments, such as news updates from Palestine, Palestinian music, interviews with Palestinian figures or non-Palestinian figures talking about Palestine, and everything else related to Palestine. Thanks for tuning in, and long live the resistance. This episode of Red Inverted Triangle, we are bringing you a conversation I've had with Dr. Yara Hawari. Yara is the co-director of Al-Shabaka, which is a Palestinian policy network launched in 2010 as the first and only independent transnational Palestinian think tank. Yara previously served as the Palestine Policy Fellow and Senior Analyst at Al-Shabaka as well. She completed her PhD in Middle East politics at the University of Exeter, where she taught various undergraduate courses and continues to be an honorary research fellow. In addition to her academic work, which focused on indigenous studies and oral history, she is a frequent political commentator, writing for various media outlets, including The Guardian, Foreign Policy, and Al Jazeera English. Yara published her first novel, The Stone House, Hajar Press, in 2021. She is also the host of the podcast Rethinking Palestine. I hope you'll find my conversation with Yara useful and productive. Enjoy. Yara, welcome to the conversation. Really delighted to have you all the way from Greece.
Ahmed, thanks for having me and inviting me to be part of this discussion.
It's absolutely my pleasure. Yara, before I usually start conversing with anybody who's especially from Palestine, I'd like to check in with you. How are you, given the whole situation that is engulfing Palestine and the West Bank and Gaza? How are you feeling?
Thank you for that question. And I think it's a really difficult one to answer, especially to a brother from Gaza to answer that question. But I think, this moment for all Palestinians everywhere has been, the most difficult moment of our lifetime, probably. And that's without exaggeration, whether we're from, the West Bank, from 48, from Gaza and diaspora. This has been a pain that has been felt across the generations across the world. And it's a pain that I think will reverberate in future generations to come. I think this moment is even overshadowing, the Nakba in terms of the scale of the catastrophe. So it's a really it's a really difficult moment. I think that's an understatement. But I also appreciate being in spaces like this, being in conversation, people like you, and especially it's an honor and a privilege to be in conversation with other Palestinians when the Israeli regime is constantly trying to isolate us and fragment us. So I really am looking forward to this discussion and appreciate the invitation.
Thank you, Yara. The honor is all mine, absolutely. You know, the current situation in the West, in the occupied West Bank is also escalating by the hour in Jenin, in Nablus, in Dol Karim, you know, and other occupied Palestinian cities. And a few weeks back, I had a conversation with Dr. Lana Tatur, who was born in the 1948 Palestine. And, you know, we discussed the public sentiment of the 1948 Palestinians towards the genocide in Gaza, and particularly focusing on, you know, the main reasons why we're not seeing some sort of proportional reactions to the level of atrocities that are happening in occupied Palestine in general and in Gaza. You know, the likes of the Unity Intifada that was occurring in, I think it was May 2021, not for the sake of criticism, you know, just to understand the underlying reasoning. So my question is, how is the genocide in Gaza impacting the Palestinians in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem? I mean, has the reaction there been sufficient? I mean, those areas are also, you know, they have their own problems. And just to add to that question, how much of that reaction, or the lack of it for that matter, is attributed to the rule of the Palestinian Authority there?
Well, firstly, I would say that no reaction is sufficient to a genocide. This is unprecedented violence that's being unleashed upon Palestinians in Gaza. And I don't think any reaction can even sort of match that level of violence that they're facing. But I think perhaps maybe it'd be worth starting with just sort of overviewing what has been happening in the West Bank since the start of the genocide in Gaza, but especially in the last few months, because it really has intensified. Since January, we've been seeing this operation, Israeli military operation, which they've named the Iron Wall, being unleashed mostly on the northern part of the West Bank. And it's named the Iron Wall because it's named after the work of the seminal work of Ze'ev Jabotinsky, who I'm sure many of you will know, was the founding father of the revisionist Zionist movement. And in that work, Jabotinsky argues that the Jewish state should be established by force. It should set up a strong, the strongest military power in order to take the land by force from the indigenous inhabitants, that is the Palestinians. And it's also widely understood that this ideology, Jabotinsky's work, is the driving force behind Netanyahu's policies. And I think it's really crucial to understand that what we're seeing unfolding in the West Bank is a zero-sum game for the Israeli regime. And the people that have been sort of at the brunt of this violence in the West Bank have been those in refugee camps. So in particular, Jenin refugee camp and Tul Karem refugee camp. It's not a coincidence that the focus is on refugee camps. These are areas that are historically home to resistance groups and have long been a thorn in the side of the Israeli regime and also the Palestinian Authority. And it's important to mention that as a prelude to the Israeli invasion of the northern West Bank and the Jenin camp, the Palestinian Authority was actually laying siege to Jenin camp for a month and a half. And it's now sort of understood that the PA was effectively clearing the way for the Israeli invasion. And as a result of this military operation, there's something like 40,000 Palestinians have been displaced from their homes in the camps. Of course, there are no governmental mechanisms on the Palestinian side to take care of them. So there are obviously some local community efforts and some NGOs, but we have many tens of thousands of people homeless, having to stay with relatives, having to, rent apartments in other cities, etc. And there have also been hundreds that have been injured and dozens killed, including many children. And then elsewhere in the West Bank, beyond the scope of the military operation, we've really seen heightened control over the lives of Palestinians. There are even more checkpoints than ever before. Palestinians aren't able to move between, workplaces and their homes, schools, hospitals, etc. So life in the West Bank has really intensified tenfold. But also, I think, and maybe this sort of addresses your question in terms of limited mobilization in the West Bank with regards to the genocide in Gaza, is that there's been mass incarceration across the board. And that's something that I think is underreported by the mainstream media, one of the many things that is underreported by the mainstream media. But there are at least 10,000 Palestinians from the West Bank who are being incarcerated. The number is a rough estimate. It might be more. But these are people that have been usually adults and also children who usually taken from their homes in the middle of the night, kidnapped by Israeli soldiers and held under administrative detention, meaning that that they're held without charge or trial. And many of those people are young people, maybe people who would have been active in terms of, student groups, or who would have been the sort of usual faces at demonstrations. So there has been a complete chilling effect on Palestinian society in the West Bank, but in particular within political spaces. And they've also been working hand in hand with the Palestinian Authority security forces. At the beginning of the genocide, there were many strikes, many demonstrations in the West Bank cities and towns. What's not commonly known is that these were put down quite brutally by Palestinian Authority security forces. In fact, the PA also killed people at these demonstrations, which again is not widely known. So there is an overall sentiment of fear. But I don't think it's only that in terms of the lack of political mobilization. I think it's fear, but also coupled with a complete demobilization of political actors in the West Bank. And I think, as you rightly said, the West Bank is not just this sort of hegemonic sort of mass of people that are just sort of living their lives. They're also under military occupation and continue to face all the hardships that come with military occupation. So I think sort of there have been unfair expectations placed on Palestinians usually from sort of allies and from Westerners looking in. Why isn't there a revolution? Why aren't Palestinians doing 1, 2, 3? Palestinians from the river to the sea, across the land, live under settler colonial occupation of one kind or another. And it's not a life that allows for, free assembly and free political mobilization. So I think there are many factors, but that certainly sort of is one explanation.
When it comes to this reaction and the really strong grip of the PA over the population in the West Bank, is that an outcome of Oslo? I've been hearing that, the Israeli governments are actually cutting off the finances from the PA. They're pretty much dumping them. So is the PA still beholden to the Oslo, their side of the accord?
Yeah, I mean that's an existential issue for them. The Palestinian Authority, the PA, was created out of the Oslo Accords. It is not in any way the legitimate representation or representative body of the Palestinian people. It was designed as a interim governing body, basically a service provider, until the time of which a Palestinian state would be established and there would be elections. We know, of course, that never happened. The Oslo Accords did not sort of reach their final phase, and no Palestinian state has been established. And so the PA sort of morphed into this authority, this governing authority, permanent governing authority that is neither elected nor enjoys popular legitimacy. And so it is the Oslo Accords, right? It is beholden to the Oslo Accords. And if, the Oslo Accords were done away with once and for all, that would be an existential question for the Palestinian Authority. And it is held very much hostage by Israel, but also by the Western donor community. Israel is able to, because of the Oslo Accords and the sort of the economic protocols, also known as the Paris Protocols of the Oslo Accords, it is allowed to collect the tax revenues on behalf of the PA. And it's a huge amount of money. And it routinely holds that money back as a sort of as leverage when it wants something from the PA. And it does that frequently at times of crisis. It does that if there's, some kind of vote at the UN and they want to put pressure on the PA not to support certain maneuvers at the UN. So very much the PA is held hostage by the Israeli regime, but also by the Western donor community, which provides a huge amount of money to the PA, which predominantly goes towards its security forces. Something that I think people need to understand about the Palestinian Authority is that it has a very bloated security sector. In fact, the budget for the security sector is more than the budget for the agricultural, education, and health sector combined. It is a very bloated structure. It's a very heavily militarized authority. And so I think people really underestimate how much of a authoritarian regime Mahmoud Abbas and his cronies are running.
I did have a conversation with Mayan Rabbani, and he put the entire blame on the lack of unity between different parties on Mahmoud Abbas solely, because he bears that responsibility. But I do want to talk about, the how as well in the Middle East, informing the PA's policies in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, the acquiescence of the Arab regimes to the Israeli and American policies and demands, talking about the situation in Syria, how much of that to the possible outrage of the Palestinians in the West Bank towards the genocide in Gaza? Is it playing a role? Are they scared of something like what could happen in the West Bank?
I mean, I think regional factors play a huge role into how the PA behaves. I think the Palestinian Authority for a long time relied on the Arab regimes for support and for, propping up. And I think that's significantly changed over the last half a decade. Palestinian Authority is not really considered a significant player anymore on a regional level. I mean, it never was significant, but now it's completely, ignored. If you look at the sort of the negotiations that have been happening since the beginning of the genocide, the Palestinian Authority has not been a part of those negotiations. Any discussions on Gaza, the Palestinian Authority is not part of those discussions. So it is being completely ignored. And I think it knows that its relevance is dwindling. And I think that's when a body like the PA can become at its most dangerous, is when it knows that its sort of days are numbered. And I think, really the Abraham Accords, which was the agreement between Israel and some of the Arab regimes, or rather what I call the sort of the weapons trade deals, because that's in reality what they were, that really sort of shifted things in the minds of the PA in terms of who their allies are. So I think, the Palestinian Authority is, having dwindling influence and significance. And I think that's when things get really tough for Palestinians in the West Bank. And we saw during the siege of Jenin refugee camp, we saw by the Palestinian Authority, we saw really unprecedented levels of cruelty and brutality at the hands of the PA that we haven't seen before. We know that this is an authoritarian regime. Violence and repression has been common ever since the PA was established. But the testimonies that we were hearing from Jenin are really akin to Shabiha style behavior, really nasty forms of sort of torture and forcing people that they've detained to recite that Mahmoud Abbas is God, really awful things. And I think that's a sign that the PA knows that its days are numbered.
It's unbelievable, the level of cruelty and oppression that the Palestinians in the West Bank are currently going through from both sides, and unfortunately. But thank you for that really great insight, Yara. I want to pivot the conversation to talk about how the current situation in Gaza been viewed in the West, in the Western society and mainstream media. How has been the role of the media in covering? Of course, it's horrible, it's terrible, but I really want to hear your insight. How is the Palestinian narrative portrayed in the West Bank? Because I've read one of your articles. I think it was at Al-Jazeera English. It's titled Unchilding Palestine's Children. Could you tie in as well, the thesis of that article into that question of how we are portrayed as, being victimized and genocided, but yet our image is just very different in the West?
Yeah, and I should say, firstly, that unchilding is a concept that was developed by the academic Nader Kevorkian, who is a Palestinian academic from Jerusalem, who was actually arrested by the Israeli police in Jerusalem because she called what is happening in Gaza a genocide, and she faced a really awful harassment and smear campaign. And Nadira really is the one to develop that concept, and basically, it speaks to the fact that, in particular, Palestinian children are evicted from the realm of childhood. So, in other words, Palestinian children are classified as adults or are described as adults to justify the violence that's committed against them. Now, if you think, in the media, the mainstream media, if you hear a report about children being killed, that's sure to evoke some kind of emotional response amongst audiences. But if you remove, childhood from that equation, if you refer to them as a sort of nondescript group of people as opposed to children, there tends to be less of an emotional reaction. And so the argument is that it's a very deliberate choice to sort of play down the youth or the childhood of Palestinian children in order to sort of make the violence that's being inflicted on them, sort of make it more justifiable. And there are many examples of this. I can share a couple. This was actually in reference to child in the West Bank, but there was a Sky News report that referred to a young Palestinian girl who had been shot by Israeli regime forces as a 3 or 4 year old young lady. You don't hear a 3 or 4 year old being referred to as a young lady usually. And it seems maybe to people who are not so familiar with the context, it might not seem significant, but when this is repeated and done constantly with regards to Palestinian children, it does strip them of their humanity. And we see as well, especially with Palestinian boys, young boys, we often see them being referred to as youths or teenagers or minors, really avoiding the use of the word child, again, to suggest that there is some kind of, that they're not innocent, basically. And we see that unchilding occur across Western mainstream media, and it's a tactic of dehumanization. And of course, it's not only Palestinian children that are dehumanized. Systematic dehumanization of Palestinians in general happens across the board. Of men, of women, of everyone. And in particular, I think since the start of the genocide, we've seen it in particular of Palestinian men. So often in terms of when you see reports on those that have been martyred in Gaza, that have been killed, you will often see a focus on children and women. And I think, and that has, not only does that erase men from the equation or sort of imply that men are inherently deserving of death or of being killed or of having violence inflicted on them, it also infantilizes women. So there are many levels to this dehumanization, and the mainstream media, the Western mainstream media, is deeply complicit in the erasure of the Palestinian narrative and the dehumanization of Palestinians, but also, I think, of whitewashing genocide. And at the beginning of the genocide, I would even go further and say, helped pave the way for the genocide to be justified.
And I think, some sectors of the Palestine Solidarity movement is also guilty of parroting these sentiments. Always when we speak at rallies or at events, we only focus on, the army is targeting children, targeting women. So we lose track that there are actually men they are also normally ignored. So that's some sort of an effort to shift the Palestinian cause to becoming more of a humanitarian one.
I would agree that, like, I think the erasure of Palestinian men is a deliberate tactic, and it's one that unfortunately, you're right to say that it is something that people within the movement, it's a trap that people within the movement also fall into. So I would really, urge people to, and sometimes it's just linguistic. I mean, I think I've even found myself occasionally like writing, children and women, and then catching myself out and thinking, why, firstly, as a feminist, why are children and women in the same category? We're not children, we're women, but also where are the men, in that category? So I think even for ourselves, it's really important to reflect on the language that we use, the language that has been normalized by the mainstream media. We have to interrogate that more often, and especially when it comes to Palestine, but also other oppressed and marginalized and colonized communities, because so much of this discourse, which is a very violent discourse, to remove Palestinian men from the equation of sympathy is an incredibly violent thing to do. And so I think we have to sort of interrogate ourselves and reflect on ourselves and reflect on the language that we're using, to make sure that we're not sort of repeating and regurgitating these very harmful narratives.
Exactly. And I really want to zoom in on this question that I just posed. I asked that question to Professor Sari Maqdisi once, and I really want to get your insight on, we're often hearing about, so I usually get people sympathize with the humanitarian situation in Gaza, but when you start talking about politics, they completely disagree with the Palestinian cause, but they feel terrible for what's happening. So has this Zionist project succeeded in reducing the Palestinian cause to just the humanitarian crisis, that we're only interested in letting food and medication into Gaza now, not interested in talking about liberation?
Yeah, I think there are two facets to that. Firstly, I think, yes, to an extent, the Zionist narrative, which has been adopted by a lot of the international community, has managed to sort of pigeonhole Palestine as not a liberation struggle, but as a sort of a humanitarian crisis, a group of people that are to be pitied and to be provided humanitarian aid. That should be provided with humanitarian aid. So it certainly has been, as a cause, it certainly has been depoliticized. But the second facet is that I think it speaks to a larger depoliticization of communities all around the world. So I wouldn't say that it's exceptional to Palestine, although I do think that there are, some specific characteristics. But I think as a whole, we as a global community are being increasingly depoliticized. And it speaks to, and I think it speaks to a lot of forces at work that really want to make sure that people aren't thinking about politics, that thinking very much in a very sort of materialistic way, in a very reductionist way, to not connect the dots and to not realize that there is a reason why this is happening to this group of people. There is a reason why, I can't afford to live, a basic life. All of these things are connected to larger structures of power, to politics. So there is a invested interest by people in power to depoliticize people around the world for colonialist interests, capitalist interests, etc. So I think, I don't want to give the Zionist project too much credit for that, because I think there are other factors at work. But I do think they have been successful in some areas to sort of depoliticizing the Palestinian cause. But then on the other hand, I do think that what we're seeing now, and I think it's really difficult for us to sort of see weaknesses in the Zionist project, especially, because it's committing a genocide on epic proportions using violence, unprecedented violence. But I think ultimately, any regime, any project, political project that resorts to committing a genocide is very weak at its core. Zionism as an ideology was built on the premise of the expulsion and erasure of another people. And I think this is inherently a weakness. And so I think, we have to remind ourselves of that. And even though it's very difficult to think of, the weaknesses of the Zionist regime in this moment, I think it's a really important thing that we should hold on to.
This is a good segue to my next question. Talking about the Zionist project that is currently committing genocide, many argue that any government or any country that commits genocide, it actually, literally committing suicide as well. None of the regimes that actually, in modern history at least, survived committing a genocide. And then we have, the legal proceedings against Israel committing plausible genocide in the ICJ. The arrest warrants against Netanyahu and the ICC and his former defense minister. But despite all of that, we haven't seen any enforcement of international law. Some argue that international law has been rendered obsolete, really, against, the impunity that Israel is enjoying. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the South African-led genocide case at the ICJ was significant in more ways than one. I think, the symbolism of a country that was under an apartheid regime and liberated itself from that regime, taking another apartheid regime to court for genocide, I think that's really powerful. And so, I do think it was more than symbolism as well. I do think the ICJ case was also about challenging US unipolarity and the world order. But I think, for many Palestinians and many of their allies, I think the genocide has really revealed the limits of international law and really its fundamental flaws. Implementation of international law will not happen if there is no political will from the most powerful states. And I think that's really, that's been really obvious, not just since the start of the genocide, but there's decades of, UN resolutions that sort of reiterate the right of the Palestinian people in the 67 territories not to be occupied. So I think that's a fundamental flaw. But I also think it's important to remember that international law was not designed with colonized people in mind. Quite the contrary. There are many instances where international law seeks to protect the integrity of colonial states. I think one of the problems is that Palestinian civil society organizations and other organizations that support the Palestinian people for a long time put all their eggs into the international law basket. And I think a lot of those organizations are reflecting on that now. And I think the challenge is not to do away with international law altogether, because there are some mechanisms that can provide some wins for the movement. But I think it's crucial to think about how we put less energy into a space that has not yielded any results. And I think it's not that international law has let down the Palestinian people. I think it wasn't designed to liberate colonized people, essentially. So I think we have to also manage our expectations of international law and also readjust our energies with those expectations.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. We can, as you mentioned in one of your articles, we can decenter international law as part of our campaigning. And that's a great mechanism, because, things have been happening for months and months, and it appears that law and order, especially now with, Trump in power, it's going to be a very, very different world. We spoke about Oslo, and many of the Palestinian communities consider it as a disaster. Edward Said wrote intensively about it. Some actually describe it similar to a Balfour Declaration, probably even worse, because it was signed by Palestinian. So I can't help but quoting something that you've written also in Al-Shabaka. You say, for many third states, the narrative of the two-state solution has been a convenient smokescreen that has effectively enabled the continued colonization of Palestinian land. So this speaks directly to the, perfunctory statements that we usually get from governments. We are for two-state solution and so on and so forth. But could you just elaborate on what you meant by that statement, and just
if you could also expand a little bit more, how does the genocide as well in Gaza factor in envisioning a future that is different from these views of two-state solutions and so on and so forth? And what are the obstacles in the way of achieving this vision? Many people are saying decolonize, dismantle apartheid.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I was talking about in that article or that paper is that essentially, the framework of two states has been used by many actors around the world in a very sort of performative way to avoid making any kind of commitment or statement to ending occupation. So rather than saying, such and such country is committed to ending occupation and apartheid and the oppression of the Palestinian people, they can just say, we're committed to a two-state solution, blah, blah, blah. So it's provided, certainly on like a discursive level, it's been very useful for states to avoid talking about their real responsibilities under international law, which is not a two-state solution, but rather ending the occupation of the 67 territories and the oppression of Palestinians across the land of Palestine. So it's really a formula that has perpetuated Palestinian oppression, and it's also limited Palestinians in terms of their sort of future visioning and future planning. I mean, in terms of Palestinian civil society, until very recently, organizations that received foreign funding were not able to talk or do work around sort of alternative visions for the future, alternative to the two-state solution. So it's been really a framework that has been enforced on the Palestinian people, with, of course, the understanding that it was our leadership that signed off on this framework. So we as a people also have to take responsibility for our leadership that did that in our name. And it's always sort of put forward as the most feasible solution, right? The sort of the most possible or rational solution, the contours of rationality and feasibility are completely defined by usually people who have never been to Palestine or have never, certainly those who have never faced oppression under the Israeli regime. So it's a completely, I don't even think we need to say it, but it's obviously a completely defunct framework for a future. And I think, thinking about the future in general is a really difficult endeavor for Palestinians. I'm not sure how you feel about it, Ahmed, but, even just thinking about next week with the genocide has just been, really, really impossible. Even thinking about, what happens next once the genocide stops and once the bombs stop falling. And that reality is by design. The Israeli regime, even prior to the genocide, designed a reality for Palestinians that day-to-day life is such a challenge and such a difficult task that just sort of getting through and surviving the present sort of takes precedence over thinking about or planning for the future. And it's something actually that is done across colonial and settler colonial projects. The aim is to sort of keep Palestinians, but also colonized and indigenous people in this sort of perpetual sort of state where there's no future, there's no past, there's only the here and now. And it, to a large extent has worked. There is limited there has been limited Palestinian future visioning because it is a really, sort of difficult task. But that's not to say that there hasn't been any, because, despite these difficulties and these challenges, Palestinians have long articulated visions and dreams for a future that is free of settler colonial oppression. And I think it's a really important task to keep thinking about the future. I think it's almost like exercising a muscle that hasn't been used in a while. And I think it's one that is a radical task. And I think it's, we can even turn to our history to think about what we want from the future. I think our history provides, a beautiful blueprint for what our future could look like. If you look at Gaza today is not what Gaza was or what it can be. You know, Gaza used to be this thriving region of Palestine that wasn't separated from Palestine, but it was a very vital and crucial part of Palestine. You know, more than that, actually, it was an important city in the whole region, and it was connected to the whole region, whether through, you know, train lines or because of the port. So I think, you know, I think it's really crucial to use our past to think about what we could achieve in the future. And that, you know, imagining the future doesn't mean a return to the past. That's, you know, not what I'm saying, but I think it can really be helpful to us in sort of drawing out the contours of what we want from our future. And just maybe I'll just end on this, but I think that in the last few decades, Gaza has really become the beating heart of Palestine. And I don't mean it in a romantic way, although it does sound romantic. But I think, you know, the point is that Gaza really does hold every aspect of the Palestinian struggle and Palestinian experience. Refugeehood, you know, resistance, resilience, all of that can be found in Gaza. And whenever I talk about this, you know, I always mention Ala Abdel Fattah, the Egyptian writer and political prisoner's words, that he wrote in an essay called Palestine on My Mind. He said that he visited Gaza twice before the revolution, but he never says that he visited Gaza. He says that he visited Palestine, and it's him who describes Gaza as the beating heart of Palestine. And I think that really resonates with me. And I think, you know, Gaza is a place that I have never been to, despite growing up only a few hours away from it. And so I think, certainly for me, in terms of thinking about a future, I think of a future where we are no longer separated from one another, where partition is a thing of the past, and Palestine was never meant to be these isolated fragments. We were never meant to live in these tiny outdoor prisons. You know, we're a people that love each other. We're a people that love community. And I think being separated from one another is the ultimate punishment. And so I think that kind of separation and partition can't be a part of any liberated future.
Thanks, Yara, for that beautiful reminder. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's actually the title of today's session, Gaza, Microcosm of Palestine. You know, I'm actually quoting that from Tarek Bakani's book as well. I mean, he described, because, you know, 85% of Gaza is actually Palestinians, you know, who are ethnically cleansed from different cities all over Palestine. So it is actually a microcosm. It is a representation. If you want to do an experiment, you want to take samples from different locations, that's a representation of Palestine. What does it mean for academic freedom going forward? You know, the adoption of new definitions of anti-Semitism, conflating the term with anti-Zionism, and how has this new definition defined a new type of humanity with the Arab identity and existence severely othered and completely placed outside of humanity? We're having our own fight here in Australia with the new definition of anti-Semitism at universities. So,
I mean, I think I won't speak with too much specificity to the IRA definition because I haven't been in an academic institution for quite some time. And so even though I'm sort of peripheral to those struggles, obviously I think it's really important to keep up the struggle, because I think that's, you know, one of the main tools that will be used to crack down on academic freedom of expression. But I think, you know, just sort of thinking about as well what's happening in the US in terms of universities and campuses and students being kidnapped and abducted. There is like the beginnings of pushback from various academic communities and institutions. And I think it's crucial in these times to think about working in coalitions. It's very easy for the powers that be, the government to isolate one academic institution and to really go all out in that space in terms of sort of enforcing repression and free speech on Palestine and Israel. But I think it makes it much more harder to do so if there are coalitions at work. And by coalitions, I mean, you know, obviously student groups and academic groups, but also institutions themselves. And that requires moral clarity from the academic institutions, which is not the case in a lot of places. In a lot of places, the administration is deeply complicit in most probably academic institutions. The administration is deeply complicit in the repression. But I think there are opportunities to push back. At the end of the day, the universities are nothing without their students and their academics. And I think just, reminding ourselves of the people power, but I think it's also really crucial to protect the most vulnerable in this moment in time, to protect students that have precarious immigration statuses, for example, students on visas, academics on visas. It's really crucial that they are not on the front lines, and that people with more privileged positions and more power and influence put themselves on the front lines in this particular struggle.
So when we talk about academic freedom and civic freedom, really, we've witnessed a lot of demonstrations back in the 70s around Vietnam War, and the same thing happened in the 80s and 90s around apartheid South Africa. Is the Palestinian struggle similar in terms of, we're seeing, all these repressive, systematic methods that governments are using against demonstrations, against, campaigning for Palestine? Is it similar, or is there something more potent for the Palestinian cause? It's more difficult than Vietnam, for example.
I think it's difficult to sort of make those assessments, especially when you're in it, right? Like we make we can look back at the mobilization around the Vietnam War and the mobilization around South African apartheid, because we have the privilege of hindsight and many decades of analysis. So I think in this current moment, it is difficult to sort of make an assessment. But I think all of these cases and contexts have different characteristics. And I think sometimes we tend to look back and think, they had it easy, or sort of romanticize the struggle and like, I wish, our demonstrations were like them demonstrations. And we have a tendency to forget the sort of the hardships and the repression, actually. The people who were involved in the protests against the Vietnam War, we forget that many people, especially in the US, and this is not an area of my expertise, but many people were incarcerated and interrogated, and they were really. It wasn't a sort of an easy ride. And the same for, South African apartheid, the protests and the mobilizations against that. I think one of the things that makes this moment different is that we're in a different time entirely. And so that means that, the mechanisms of repression we've seen over the last 2 decades, how they've developed has been really intense. So we're seeing a totally different level of repression, purely because of the sort of technological advances in those systems of oppression. But I think with sort of more time, we'll be able to do those sort of more analytical assessments. But I think every struggle, especially the struggles that you've mentioned, have gone through really, really tough times. And no struggle was ever won easily. And that's, precisely why it's called struggle.
Couldn't agree more. What do you think is holding back countries like Ireland, for example, from truly committing action on Palestine and making a difference? Is it just about power and money, capital?
Yes. It's more complicated than that, and probably deserves a lot more time. But I think, we have a tendency to think of Ireland as this, great supporter of Palestine. And on a popular level, it is, the people of Ireland and the people of Palestine have a history of solidarity between the two struggles against colonialism. And that's something that, we hold very, very dear to us. But on a state level, the story is quite different, even though there'll be, there might be statements of condemnation of the Israeli regime. In terms of concrete action, Ireland has been very weak and certainly does not live up to the legacy, that historical legacy or popular sentiment. And, it's not just Ireland. I think it's countries around the world who are, not willing to take sort of concrete actions, steps or measures because the cost is too high for them, whether that's sort of in terms of in a diplomatic sense or whether that actually is in a more sort of a material sense. And now we're seeing countries that do take more of a stand against the Israeli regime, they're facing, direct consequences from the Trump administration. So it does come with a cost, supporting Palestinians and speaking out against genocide. And I think most countries in the world are not willing to pay the price.
Talking about money and capital, and this is probably where BDS comes in to play, to make it more expensive for the sustenance of this system of colonization and occupation. So to that end, has the BDS been a successful tool in pressuring Israel to abide by its obligations under the international law, making it more expensive to maintain?
No, I don't think Israel has been pressured to abide by international law. What I do think the BDS movement has been successful in is making actors and third states sort of reconsider and even pull out of their sort of investment into the Israeli regime. So we've seen, and there are a lot of statistics on this that I don't have to hand, but over the sort of last, BDS was established as a movement 2 decades ago now. And over the last 2 decades, we've seen significant wins where companies have, divested from Israel as a direct result of campaigns and pressure from activists all over the world. And that has resulted in a form of isolation for the Israeli regime. And I think, BDS is one of the most significant tools in our arsenal towards Palestinian liberation, certainly in terms of sort of forcing some kind of pressure and isolating the Israeli regime. I think it's had some very significant wins, but I think there is a lot more work to be done. And now is really the time to escalate that kind of work and those kinds of campaigns.
Couldn't agree more. Sanctions is very critical, an important thing to be done or to be campaigned for as well. We can boycott all we want, but unless governments really take a stance and impose sanctions, it'll be a bit difficult.
Can I just interject here with regards to boycott? I think it's also really important that we remember that, boycott is a tactic, and one that should be part of sort of strategic campaigning. So when we talk about boycotting, products, I think it can get overwhelming because the list of companies that are complicit in Israeli apartheid and oppression is really endless and very much sort of part of sort of day-to-day items that people use. And I think people can feel very overwhelmed by this and then sort of not want to engage because they think, oh, well, I can't, I already have an iPhone, I already have this from Zara or this or whatever, I can't boycott. But that, the BDS movement does not, does encourage, ethical consumerism, but it also encourages strategic campaigning and targeting. So picking, as a strategic target for a boycott campaign is really crucial. And that's how you make sort of incremental wins. It's not sort of telling everyone to boycott everything in one go, but rather picking a target and focusing all energies on that target, and forcing them to divest and to pull out of their business from Israel and then moving on to the next one. And I think that's a really sort of important way to think about boycotts and divestment.
Absolutely. This is where we make the best gains, focusing our efforts on a certain target. And in that way, also, we can create an educational campaign around boycott, like people understand why are we boycotting and so on and so forth. So they will educate themselves about the overarching reason. There's a question about what about other Arab nations? They appear to be very friendly with Israel. Any chance any Arab nations that can push back against Israel diplomatically? Of course.
Yeah, I think it's not a coincidence that the friendliest countries with the Israeli regime are also the most authoritarian domestically. And so I think that's why we always need to remember that Palestinian liberation is inherently tied to the liberation of the region. Palestine isn't going to be liberated whilst we have, dictators, leaders oppressing other people in neighboring countries. And I think there is overwhelming support for the Palestinian struggle among the peoples in the region. That's very clear. We've seen massive protests, in Jordan and Bahrain and in places where protests are allowed. But in terms of popular sentiment, we know from polling from, various different institutes that the overwhelming majority of Arab people and, other people in the region still stands with the Palestinian people, and that their governments do not reflect popular sentiment. And so I think it's crucial to remember that. It's crucial to remember that, the Abraham Accords was not only a really, really bad thing for the Palestinian struggle, but also for the people in the region. The Abraham Accords was, a weapons agreement. A lot of countries got promised all kinds of sort of weapons and surveillance technologies that they could possibly use on their own populations. So I think it really ushers in a frightening era for the people of the region. And so that's why I think it's important to remember that as Palestinians, our liberation is inherently tied to the liberation of the region.
There's a question talking about the impact of the ongoing genocide in Gaza on the state of Israel itself. We had a couple of conversations actually with Shir Hever last year, probably 8 months ago, and he were hinting upon the fact that there, some sort of economic collapse in Israel, due to the losses and so on and so forth. Also, the army is very tired. So the question here is, do you believe that Israel is close to imploding, that the end is near? Of course, given the internal conflicts between the different parties. So what are your thoughts?
No, I don't. And I'm sorry to give such a short answer, but I don't think that that's the case. I don't think Israel is going to implode anytime soon. I think, I do think that Israeli society is a crisis point. I think the genocide has been, revealing for them in many ways, but perhaps not in the ways that we would want it to be revealing. But I think there are serious tensions and fractures in Israeli society. I think it's not necessarily around the fact that this violence is being inflicted on Palestinians, but I think it's the level of violence. So I don't think it's about whether or not violence should be used on Palestinians, but I think it's to what level. I think the point about the economy is a really important one. It's being massively underreported and even sort of covered up by the Israeli government, that this genocide has had a huge impact on the Israeli economy, and it's been really hit in a hard way. Not only have companies pulled out of Israel and people pulling out their investments, but there are also sectors that have been really sort of really struggling as a result of the genocide. The tourism sector, for example, tourism is a very big market traditionally for the Israeli regime, and it's been completely hit by the genocide. So I think that's certainly the case, although I think your previous guest probably had sort of more insight and details into that.
Unable to expel Gazans en masse, Israel now forces them into closed-off zones and letting starvation, desperation do the rest. There are two names for that, concentration camps and extermination camps. What can we do?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really difficult time. We've been protesting and screaming and mobilizing for, well over a year and a half. And we haven't been able to bring about a lasting ceasefire. And so it's very difficult to think sort of in this moment, what can we do? But I think there are things. I mean, we talked about sort of BDS in terms of mobilization. We talked about campaigns, but I think it's really also important to remember that Palestine isn't, in a bubble. It's not this sort of, not only this sort of far off place that exists separate to other politics. I think crucially working on the politics where you live, wherever that is, changing, your representatives and politicians, making sure that you're working to include Palestine in your local politics is crucial. And it's long-term work, unfortunately. It's not a short-term fix, but it's really important work nonetheless.
I mean, it's a marathon and we can't really lose hope. We have to keep going and, keep fighting. Like you said, Palestine is not really in a bubble. It's a collective struggle, against colonialism and all these indigenous peoples across the different countries that have been colonized, like this one here. We should all be collectively working together and campaigning together, because freedom for Palestine is not just for Palestine, it's for everyone. So I do echo your sentiment there. I really want to thank you very much, Yara, for your amazing insight. Is there anything that you would like to tell us before we conclude this as an advice? How do we continue doing what we're doing?
I think, I think we covered a lot, but maybe perhaps just sort of on a final note, it's important that people are not dismayed in this moment. It's incredibly overwhelming, and it's the horrors that we're seeing every day. It's easy to feel a sense of sort of paralysis in this moment. But I think it's important to remember that we owe it to brothers and sisters and comrades in Gaza not to give up, that just because over a year and a half of mobilization hasn't resulted in anything doesn't mean that we stop. It means that we rethink and reflect on the tactics and the things that we've been doing, and we really put in everything we have, because we don't have the luxury of time. Our brothers and sisters and comrades in Gaza don't have the luxury of time. And so now is really the time to sort of escalate and to put in everything that we have.
Yeah, I take your point. We got to keep pushing and intensify our actions. On that note, Yara, thank you so much for your time. It's been a delightful conversation. Hopefully we can host you again at some point in the future.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. And thanks to everyone listening.
You've been listening to The Palestinian Show, Red Inverted Triangle. If you'd like to learn more about Palestine, or if you'd like to get involved in the Palestine Solidarity Movement, please follow Palestine Justice Movement Sydney on Instagram or Facebook. And keep tuning in to Red Inverted Triangle. My name is Ahmed. I will see you next time.